Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Cisco. Welcome to CJP's Facebook Live show. We're honored today to have Elce Redmond, the real deal when it comes to organizing in Austin. Don't take those phony mayoral candidates who said they've been doing it for years, but you can't find anything behind that. This just to give you a little transparency here, Elce has been or is a former member of CJP's board of directors. Elce, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Hey, Tracy, thanks for having me.
Okay, so Elce is the organizing director of the South Austin Coalition. So before we get into our topic of the day, I want to find out what is the South Austin Coalition? What does organizing there mean? What have you been doing?
So the South Austin Coalition was a community organization in the Austin community. Had been there since 1978. They organized on a variety of different issues, from housing to health care, public safety, and tries to continue that sort of tradition. Unfortunately, we lost the executive director, the great Bob Andrasic, a couple of years ago. So at this point, the organization itself has been rather stagnant. But there's been this rich organizing sort of tradition, and I think that other younger people are taking up that sort of banner at this point.
All right, awesome. So let me set the stage here for our audience. We're going to be talking about two concepts or two things here that have little to do with each other. There's a difference between community policing, what that was meant to be, and what that was thought of by communities. Where, by the way, community policing in Chicago originated. It did not originate as a policing program. I know that doesn't make the media and you don't hear about it and you don't know about it unless you were around. Where the benefit today is we have someone who was around previous to what Chicago Police Department calls their community policing program, which is called CAP, Chicago's Alternative Policing Strategy. You see there, you don't see community anywhere in the name. So that rolled out in 1993, and we're going to get to some numbers and statistics about CAPS and what CAPS has done. But first, I want to get to what was going on in the communities previously to community CAPS being put into place by the CPD. What were communities talking about?
Well, before this whole sort of caps thing had came up. What community organizations like SAC and the Northwest Austin Council and Northeast Austin Organization, the Mid Austin Steering Committee, all of these organizations were already engaged in on the ground organizing work, talking to residents about what the issues that they were concerned about. One of the issues were public safety. People were concerned about what was happening in their community and how that those issues would affect them. So, as a community organization, we listened to people about what those issues were. And based on what they were seeing, sort of try to develop strategies where community people can address these issues, but also address these issues not in a way that, it is sort of draconian and going after folks, but as totally working together to try to figure these sort of issues out rather than having some sort of adversarial relationship with people. We tried to build a real sort of beloved community, so to speak.
I did a radio show way too many years ago. We've both been involved in these issues to one extent or another for way too long and probably way longer than we want to admit. But on my radio show, I had Warren Friedman, who was
Mhm.
the executive director during this time of Chicago Alliance for Neighborhood Safety. And he framed it as what communities were looking for was the ability to have like a little bit of self-determination, a little bit of power to combat what in Chicago is called the political machine, combat the fact when they weren't getting services, really looking to find a way to harness city resources and city funding and money from city hall to come into communities and empower them. So if they had aldermen they didn't like or weren't responsive, they could find a way to challenge them and take them on. Does that sound like what you experienced?
Yes. A lot of it in terms of the issues of accountability, and accountability was very important. Not only from accountability from the police, but accountability from the elected officials, and accountability from the city and the state and the state legislature as well. And it was important to really understand that monies were not coming into the communities at all, and that the communities wanted this money primarily to address many of their socioeconomic sort of issues. And on the issue of accountability, I mean, that was like very, very important because it wasn't that you had an adversarial relationship with any sort of elected official. It was more of, are the services for this community being provided to this community? And a lot of times that was not happening at all. And that's why people sort of took to the streets. But the whole goal was to have accountability across the board, from the police department to the elected officials to the city itself.
Right. So let's talk. So what years? CAF starts out in 1993. So when you were doing this work, this is the late 80s, early 90s in
Yeah.
Austin.
So,
When you're talking
yes.
about this time frame.
Yeah, so I'm talking
Okay.
about 1989 to that sort of like 93 sort of period. And that was when things began to change in the community around sort of like, 88 to 89. What businesses were leaving like the community. So we had lost, by that time, Brock's Candy Company was like closing down. Leaf Brand Candy Company was closing, and they're going to merge with a Finnish conglomerate. So we had this sort of issues of deindustrialization happening, as well as sort of the impact of crack cocaine into the community. And that geared up a lot of people to do some incredible sort of organizing, but the kind of sort of organizing that really looked at the symptoms of the problem itself rather than the sort of the superficial sort of symptoms. We really wanted to get to the core of what was happening within the community and how can we rebuild the community so that everyone has a stake in it.
Okay. So this is Richard Daley time. This is
Yes.
Mayor Richard. This is his mayoralship time. This is early on in his mayoralship. Do you think they viewed the community version of what you wanted? Was that a threat to them? Do you view the
Oh,
machine, the
absolutely.
dailies?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know what? The way the machine had worked, something where people are making decisions and people are empowered within their communities. It threatens not only sort of like the city structure, but it also threatens local elected officials. So it was a total sort of threat because we were developing long-term strategies, long-term sort of tactics. We had a total vision of what the community could look like if these issues were like addressed. And of course, the Manchurian candidate that was like Daley didn't want that.
Right. So, who do you remember? Who was the alderman who were the aldermen in the Austin
All right,
area
so
at that time, by
the
any chance?
29th, the 29th ward, at that time in the 80s, it was Danny Davis, but he had became congressman, and there was another one of his aides that took over, Sam. I don't remember sort of like his name, but he, well, he was who he was. Let's say that. Okay.
So, but he was regardless of his last name, it's fair to say that he was part of the machine to some extent or
Oh,
another.
absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? Really didn't have the sort of sense that we could build something for the long term and have a vision for the community itself. It was more of, well, you know what, you guys are bad mouthing me, or you know what, you guys are going against me, and that was really not the intent whatsoever. Now, there were times when people said that, well, there were certain services that should have been provided and weren't being provided. Now, that's a legitimate sort of concern and a legitimate issue, so you should treat it legitimately. But it was always felt that, well, you know what, this person is set up to run against me at some point, and these community groups are supporting this individual over that individual, which was not going on whatsoever.
Right, but it was the fear of losing, of having of having any power reside actually in the people in the communities, right? They didn't
Oh,
want to
right.
get, they didn't want to
They don't want
relinquish
that.
the
Oh,
power.
no. No, no, they didn't. They definitely never want to relinquish power whatsoever. It was always trying to. They were always trying to control. They were always trying to dictate. They were always trying to intimidate, and we would push back on those issues.
Okay, so let's say late '80s. Give our audience and our viewers here an idea of what the relationship was between the community and the police. Because when I want to structure, and we're going to go through this a couple times in this interview, but when you hear people, well, the relationship's got to get better, it's got to get better, it's got to get better. I always want to ask people, when was it good? Right?
Mhm.
When is this? What are you shooting for? What's your target? Because you hear politicians of all stripes, Daley, Rahm Emanuel, Lori Lightfoot, all the aldermen. They harken back to a yesteryear of police community relations, but you can never nail them down on when that elusive community relations were good with the police. So I just want to get an idea of what they were back in the late '80s.
You know what? One of the things is that the relationships were sort of similar to what the relationships are today. Okay, that it was rather sort of adversarial like relationships, based on, of course, what the police were doing like today, is the same thing that they were doing like in the '80s. And unfortunately, there wasn't like a cell phone camera everywhere, so they were doing the exact sort of same things, and harassing people who were not involved in any sort of like criminal activity whatsoever. So that relationship was adversarial. I think what happened in terms of the 15th district, which is like the police district in Austin, there was a commander, a police commander, he came in and who did have a vision, and really wanted to buy into the work that we were doing in the community. So I think that changed the sort of like relationship somewhat. But eventually, the powers that be became jealous and envious of him, and at some point he was removed.
That's how it works. They do not want to. They don't like that too cozy of a relationship. That
Right, and
it
they don't want
challenges
to.
the status quo.
Right. They don't want to change. Okay. And it was obvious up front and early that they were not willing as a unit to really sort of change how they dealt with the community. What were the issues, really follow what the issues were and what people were telling them what the issues were. And it was more of coming in there, with guns blazing, and that will solve the issue itself. And it was just like, it didn't work then, and it's definitely not working now.
So you mentioned earlier about the root causes of violence in Austin. At that time, what was your understanding of what those root causes were?
Well, one of the things is that early on, and this is like in the late '80s and '90s, we had saw violence as a public health issue, and that violence at that time should have been treated as a public health issue. And rather than bringing in more cops and more security and like more surveillance, should have brought in like more counselors, more nurses, more like resources for the community to address these issues on their own. So early on, we talked about that violence as a health issue. Now, based on that, what do we do? And how do we address violence? And that became sort of the core of like the organizing that we were doing, that looked at the broader picture. That you just can't say, all right, we're going to like shut this drug house down, and that's going to be sort of like the end of the issue itself. No, right? Substance abuse was a major issue, both through alcohol or like drugs. How do we address those like issues? If people wanted to get help, there were no programs within the community to assist them. So a lot of times, if a person was arrested and got out of jail, well, they had to come back into the same community with the same sort of friends that they had before, who are either still involved in the drug trade. So it was those kind of issues that we're looking at in terms of, okay, what do we need to do? And also the issue of employment was very important, and it was something that the city would not really sort of look at and really sort of put some work into. They would do these summer job programs, but those jobs are only for a small core of people, and it wasn't open up to the people who really needed those kind of jobs and those kind of opportunities.
All right. It's so sad here that we're talking about the same issues now, right? There's part
Oh,
of the whole defund the police movement is, can we get finally an alternative response to a mental health issue that isn't violent? Can we not send a cop and send a mental health specialist? You know, we're having the same arguments. It's pretty sad that we're sitting here talking about the late '80s, early '90s, and we're basically asking the same questions, and it's 2020.
right, because the system itself doesn't want to change. Right? The police sort of view themselves as an occupying force. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to come in there like gangbusters and arrest a lot of people. And you know what? You can get the good people within there and the bad people. They say, well, you know what? Let the courts sort them out. So I think that attitude and behavior is consistent, and that attitude behavior is not going to change, all right? And I know that everyone's talking about, well, we need to change, we need to do this and all of that, but really, the way the police are structured, there's not going to be any sort of significant changes. And they may do like a little more having police walk the beat, and do the officer friendly sort of routine, but in its core and its essence, that the system will not change.
Right, and this was, we'll get back to caps in a minute, but that was one of my issues when people were talking about Lori Lightfoot taking over as mayor, and I know Lori. Um, but I said, we'll know everything we need to know about her administration pretty much in the first budget. Will there be a reallocation or elimination of the tax increment financing program and that slush fund? Will it be
Hmm.
eliminated and those resources readdressed to the south and west sides, or there won't be? Because in my opinion, unless you get down to the financial issues and figure those out and find a way to deal with poverty, we're really not going to have huge success in violence reductions or crime reductions without doing that. I'm sick of hearing poor. We just need to make sure poor people, mostly black and brown, just have to make better choices. They just have to come to terms
Yeah.
with being poor, with no opportunities and no education and no jobs, and they just have to come to terms with live peacefully that way.
Yes, and you know what?
Um,
We're talking about issues of the 80s and the early sort of 90s, and but in 2020 those issues haven't changed. There's massive disinvestment within the community. There's this sort of sense that the violence is the faults of fathers not being in the household or some ridiculous crap like that. And it's always blaming the people for the violence that exists within their communities, rather than looking at, hey, how do we make some sort of changes here, because what we're doing ain't working. Okay, putting people in jail and building this sort of prison industrial complex isn't working. All right, and it's not reducing any sort of violence itself. And when there are programs that out there that are trying to do just that, well, those programs are looked upon as being suspect or being run by unsavory sort of characters. I mean, like the interrupters and folks like that who are on the street corners, really trying to stop most of this sort of interpersonal violence, which a lot of the violence was based on sort of interpersonal relationships that culminated in people sort of instead of talking them out, they wanted to shoot out the issues. And there are a lot of good organizations who are on the ground trying to really work and make some changes within the community, but they're not given the opportunities or the funding to really sort of continue.
no, it's a system that self-replicates. That's the bottom line. I mean, when you talk, and CAPS is partly responsible for this, But when all you're the only solution you can bring in is the police and the justice system to what's going on in communities like Austin and on the south and west sides. That's the only solution. It's a self-replicating. You arrest that guy for selling on the corner, you're guaranteeing, or at least greatly increasing the odds that that person, after he gets out, is going to be back on that corner 5 years later, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you've just now hampered. You haven't made his life better. All you've done is made his life worse.
Right,
So,
because everything is punitive. So it's like that's give people these long term sort of sentences. Let's like send a message that we will not accept this sort of like behavior in this society. And what it's done is I don't think it has done anything to address violence, to address unemployment, to address disinvestment at all.
no, because that would take TIF realignment and would take raising certain people's taxes. It would take all kinds of things. It would take stop funding the cranes downtown, all the building, Fulton Market. I can't imagine how much money we threw in the Fulton Market to make it what it is today. But you know where that money came from. Okay, so I'm going to stop ranting on that issue, although I could do it all day. I
No,
did it all
no,
last
no. I
week with
mean,
Paul
like
Vallis.
those are wait a minute. Well, Tracy, those are very important issues to be ranting
Yeah.
about because there's money going into the Fulton market that could have went into many of these like communities all across the city itself. All right. And the priorities of the administration is to put money in those areas for the upper middle class white folks instead of then putting that money into communities for blacks and Latinos. All right, and that's the bottom line right there. Now, of course, what like Lightfoot and many of these other sort of like politicians would say, "Oh no, 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 you're absolutely wrong. You're no, 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 no. You're misunderstanding what we're trying to do." No, no one's misunderstanding what you're trying to do. It is obvious and right in our faces that you don't give a damn whatsoever.
Right. And the reality is, I talked about this last week with Paul Vallis. I've talked about it with Barry Friedman on the show too. The reality is, if you take tax increment financing, my opinion is every time a city dollar, a city penny goes into any kind of development and ends up funding anything that a private contractor is building, we should be able to install requirements or instill whatever requirements about who they employ, right? Who they're training on
Mm-hmm.
those jobs. Do you want to build that, like we put 200 million or 100 or 200 million into that damn stadium up by McCormick Place? I can never remember the name of it. But it's like, all right, you're getting $100 million, great. 50% of, or like 85% of your employees, if you want to build this, have to be from the city, or 100%. And not only that, but like 50% have to come from these certain zip codes and have to look this certain way, have to meet these demographic standards. And by the way, here's an extra 100 people you are going to spend, and they're going to be divvied up among the trades, and you're going to train them on this job with our money, right? How we're paying them $100 million. We have no idea who they're employing, where those jobs are going. And for what it's worth, Alderman Fioretti, when he first ran in the second ward, which was the South Loop and Bronzeville area at that time, he said he walked the ward one time. He walked the whole ward during the election. He told me he kept going to all these job sites and talking to the workers, and none of them lived in Chicago. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, what are we doing spending? All right, that project got $20 million of city money, and now it's going to some rich owner who's a contractor, and all the workers are from the suburbs. Like, what are we doing
Mm-hmm.
putting our money employing people from the suburbs? Now, if you're going to, there are arguments whether or not we should fund them at all, but if we're going to, it ought to be that money is going into people who live, the pockets of the people who live in the city, and to develop as best we can and train people and give them opportunities from the wards and neighborhoods that most need it. Right?
Yeah,
I don't.
that
It
would
just
be the way to
it
do it,
befuddles
but
me. No,
that would
yeah,
be the way
that's
to. But unfortunately, that's not the way that it happens. And I think that that's sort of like the seeding anger that you see within the communities itself, because people are very well aware of what's going on, and they're well aware of where monies are going and where are the job opportunities. And I think that sees that anger to the point that it boils up, as we have seen during like the rebellion, and some of the unfortunate sort of issues that occurred with that. Well, what happens to those businesses? All right, and are those businesses going to get some sort of relief in terms of like trying to reopen? And you know what, we had COVID, which had I think severe sort of like not only sort of like economic, but also a personal human impact on like many of
Yep.
these like low income communities. And what's going to happen? And there's no money's coming back into these communities. Now I know that the mayor's office announced some sort of initiative on the south and the west sides for some sort of reinvestment, but we've lived through many of these sort of major announcements, and they're great announcements, and they get a lot of sort of media attention, but in the end, when there's sort of an analysis of it, did it really sort of benefit the people that it was supposed to benefit?
Well, right, and this is the reality. We have looked, and this is since the late '80s, and definitely since the mid '90s forward. We have looked at, and this is in the South Loop too. Is a great example. Fulton Market too, and other ones. It's happening a little bit in the 28th ward now, and it's happening in Pilsen. And Lightfoot got caught making ill-advised comments. But the reality is, we look at gentrification as a crime prevention tool, right? When you talk about investment in these communities, it ends up being we're going to go throw money into those communities and move those poor people out. It's not done in a
Mhm.
way to economically help those people and lift them up. So if I was on the south and west sides and I heard economic development was coming to my community, it would make honestly, I think it would make me scared.
Of
It wouldn't
course,
be
of
something that
course.
made me happy.
I think, of course,
So
and Austin and probably all these other communities. I mean, that's one of the sort of concern on the South Side in terms of the Obama library. There's massive concerns from people that it's just another tool to displace them. And I know that there's been like some sort of negotiations and sort of promises that won't happen, but we know that a promise is one thing, and the reality of what they promise is the absolute other.
yeah, no doubt. All right, so let's get back to CAPS. So when you
Okay.
heard this CAPS program was starting in Austin, what were your feelings towards it originally?
Well, originally, like I said before, we had like this police commander, like Commander Leroy O'Shields, all right, who like
Mm-hmm.
was unlike any other cop we ever met, because he had vision, and he saw that what they were doing wasn't really working very well and effectively. Which of course, community organizations and academics and everyone tried to inform them early on that what you guys were doing is not the right way to do it. All right. And based on his sort of vision, when we started having these sort of like the initial sort of CAPS meetings, they were run by the community. They talked about issues that the community were like concerned about. It had accountability for both the police as well as the elected officials. And at the end of it, it sort of laid out sort of like a timetable for how we wanted to address these issues moving forward.
And just for my audience, I probably should have said this earlier, but CAPS, Chicago's Alternative Policing Strategy, came, like we discussed earlier, it was kind of born out of community activism, but then was taken by the Daley administration and given to academics, white males, shockingly, in the early '90s at UIC in the what is now the criminology department, but was the criminal justice department, Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research, I think it's called, and Loyola's crim department. And it was redesigned into a policing program rather than a community empowerment program, which is really what it was born out of. Because obviously, as we talked earlier, Daley, the machine, they had no interest in true community power, but they wanted a system or a program they could tout that was about community empowerment and engagement. And you can tell right from the beginning, it's called CAPS. Nowhere in there is the name community, first of all. Second of all, if you're going to change a 13,000 or I think it was around 13,750 officers is what they were budgeted at that time. you're going to change a department, you can't make something a program. It has to be a philosophy about everything they do. So, anyways, that is how CAPS got designed and outlaid, and that's how it came top to bottom out as a policing thing that the police were going to run, rather than a community-driven program that was going to empower the communities, as Elce said earlier, to hold everyone accountable, themselves, political leaders, all kinds of city hall, all kinds of the services that were provided to them. Okay, so what was the average CAP meeting like originally when you first went to them? What was the first CAP meeting like?
Well, the community organizations were the ones that really sort of like turned people out for these meetings itself. All right. So when we first started, we had like, a huge sort of turnout for like many of these meetings, and the agendas, we laid out what the agendas were. And within that agenda was sort of like these issues of accountability. What are the police doing about these issues? What are the elected officials doing about like services? What is the city doing about providing like long-term services for people in the community? So that's how those meetings originally sort of started. And, they were really good sort of like meetings where you could develop leaders at. Where, you gave like a community person, a spot on the agenda itself to raise an issue that they were so passionate about. And they had an opportunity to speak about these issues and talk about some of the solutions to them. So those how the meetings sort of really started, and we were getting really a lot of participation from the community. They were really sort of like meetings that were accountability sessions more than just meetings itself. And I think that was really something that was very powerful, like not only for me but the people within like those meetings in the community. That you're going to come to those meetings and you're going to get something done. You're not going to come to the meetings and sort of complain, moan, and groan about something, and then sort of go home like angry. That was not what those meetings were about. They were about actual accountability. They were about getting things done. They're about looking toward the future.
Okay, so were these meetings, were they that way because of the community and your organizations and the community organizations setting the agenda? Or was this because this is how the police wanted the meetings to be?
No, this was the community organizations themselves sort of setting the agenda for the meetings. It was the community organizations who were responsible for turnout. It was the community organizations who like laid out the agenda, and based on what the issues were, it was community organizations who like mobilized people to follow up on those like issues. And I think after a couple of years, okay, the cops thought that, okay, this is ridiculous. All right, we can't have this anymore. These people are telling us what we should be doing. Elected officials were coming to the like meetings and getting beat up about I think issues that they should be addressing, and they weren't. And it wasn't anything sort of political about this whatsoever. It was all about accountability, but they turned it like to the people and say, well, these people are against me and they're going to run against me. And these community organizations are supporting this candidate or that candidate, which was not happening at all. It was all just a ruse for the police and the city to co-opt the meetings into to a point that, the community organizations were pushed out, and that whole sort of system of accountability was gone. And then these meetings just became a bunch of like cops wanting people to snitch on their like neighbors, and have
How long did,
a few sort of community people who they were paying. Now that's another thing. A lot of the CAPS people who, once the community organizations got out of like the CAPS meetings, the city started paying like beat facilitators. So these folks were actually getting paid by the city, and what they would do is, they would have the meetings, and after a while, the meetings started to get smaller and smaller, primarily because they weren't really addressing the issues that people were concerned about. And once those meetings started to get smaller and smaller, like the beat facilitator would just turn the meeting over to the cops, and the cops would sort of run the meeting itself, and basically sort of like try to create a snitch network.
okay, so how long did it take? I mean, let me back up and say, when was the first sign for you that how the community organizations were running these meetings, um, was running up against the interests of the police and the aldermen and the politicians and the machine.
I think that maybe 6 months into it, it became sort of like apparent in terms of some of our like meetings with the cities and folks that there was seemed like this pushback in terms of what we're attempting sort of to do. And I remember such a meeting like that we had, and at that meeting we didn't express sort of like, hey, you know what, you guys are not going to do this. It was more of, well, they were putting money into the like the beat facilitators and the beat teams, so it became obvious that they were going to try to co-opt this sort of issue itself and co-opt this sort of beat meetings. And you know what, we wanted to maintain that we didn't want that, but many of those beat facilitators, once they got started to get paid, well, their loyalty shifted from the community to what the people who were paying them itself, and these meetings sort of dissipated into pretty much as snitch sessions.
It's interesting. I know back then that we talked about earlier, the Chicago Alliance for Neighborhood Safety, I think it's what it was called, or CANS is the acronym. CANS did a study early on in CAPS, because that's what they did. That's some of what they did. They published a survey with Chicago youth, right? And about how they felt about the police. I think a more recent version came out from the University of Chicago, which I think they thought they were the first one to ever survey youth, which is untrue. But anyways, that survey was not flattering to the Chicago Police Department or the city.
Mm-hmm.
And CANS had contracts to help with beat meetings, and they were warned not to, by the Daley administration, warned not to put that report out or else. And Warren, being who Warren is, he put it out, and that was the end of their contract.
Mm-hmm.
They got it summarily terminated by the city because they couldn't handle the fact that the youth of Chicago would have negative perceptions of the police.
Of course, because what the whole sort of program in terms of what the police wanted was to showcase how great they were and how community minded they were, and that's further from the truth. And today it's even further from the truth.
I went to several beat meetings back in 2011 to around 2010, 2011 in North Lawndale. And it was interesting to me. I would see these 10, 11, 12 people, and I saw a number of women go to the talk during the meeting and would say to the police, "You need to get my kid off that corner." And I was like, oh. It's like, the police only have one way to get your son off that corner, ma'am, and that's to arrest your son.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows what's going on in that corner. So it was a shame. It's like a double standard, right? Because the meetings are there for these people to get help, theoretically, right? The marketing says that. But yet there's really no help for them to be found in the meetings, right? There's nothing constructive. It is only policing solutions. And, love or hate the police, they only have they have the toolbox they've been given. As almost all other, public employees have a certain toolbox of resources and training that they have. And I'm not against the beat meetings necessarily, but like, why there weren't more representation from city services in these meetings? Why the Department of Health have a representative in every beat meeting, right? All of these city services should have had people in there so that mothers or people who wanted help with whatever could go to these meetings and find that help. That just doesn't seem, I'm sure it was done on purpose because the only thing they could get is more policing.
Right. And I mean, that's what those meetings sort of like disintegrated into. It was just, the police would like run the meetings, talk about arrests that they made, ask people for help in terms of like who was doing what, who was selling drugs here and who was selling drugs like there. And, people who were starting going to those meetings were being suspected of being sort of, um, sort of spies for the police itself. And you don't want to be in a community where you're considered a spy for the police. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when we first started this, we had people from different sort of social service agencies and city agencies there to address many of these other issues that came up in meetings. So you looked at this sort of like cap. This is like beat meeting as something more than just about policing issues. That it was more about what like a vision of the community where you can come to these meetings and there be numerous amount of resources there to assist on some other issues that the community folks may have.
So how long did you and the other community organization people and leaders, how long did you last actually working to get people out to meetings and in the beat meetings? How long did that actually last?
You know what? That sort of like lasted for, I think, about 6 months. And it was pretty obvious that the city wanted to really sort of like control this. There were some organizations who were, acceptable of doing this. There were many like ours that was like, no, we're not going to do this. So there was a split among sort of the community organizations that there were some who went along with the police and there were some who didn't. And one things that we did is said, okay, you know what, we don't really need the police for kind of organizing that we're doing. We don't really need them involved in our meetings like at all right, we can move in an agenda that's really sort of community like based rather than something that the cops want us to rat everybody out kind of like system. And we didn't want to be have any sort of involvement in something like that. So we just went on and did our own sort of organizing separate from like these other entities, but pushing many of these issues of like mass unemployment, like discrimination in like housing, disinvestment, and the lack of investment from the city, and really going into organizing campaigns that really sort of reflected like a need for some change on the city and the state level.
So CAPS has been, or community policing in Chicago has been around since 1993.
Mhm.
What massive, one would expect to find, what massive changes would you say, justice wise, safety wise, has Austin experienced during that time? Right? Because you would think if CAPS is this big success, then there should be
Mhm.
documented changes in the community from CAPS.
You know what? I mean, like, in terms of long term, no, I don't think that there's been any sort of subsequent changes that CAPS has brought at all. I think that there's been a massive amount of failures from like CAPS and how they really sort of turned CAPS into this sort of like, pro police, pro lock them up kind of meetings. And I think it dissuaded many of the community people who really wanted to address issues of accountability from both the police and elected officials and the city. So I think that it was a failure, and they may say that, hey, this is what we've done, but in the end, if you have a community that is distrustful of the police, who are distrustful of your elected officials, who are distrustful of the city, then that is not successful. That is a defeat for these programs that they talk about in high regard.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I was when we were pushing our police board ordinance back in 2009 or maybe late 2009, early 2010. Our police board reform that Daley passed on, but Ron passed, I think, in 11, September of 11. Um, we went to a meet with an alderman in Portage Park who I can't remember his name. He's now a judge. And somehow we got on the topic of caps, and he did not like it. He thought it was a joke. And he said, That's Daley's best reelection strategy ever. Giving people to think they have control over the police in their community. And he's like, as if anything has really changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pretty shocked by that reality that I was shocked that Alderman would tell you that, honestly. I was like, whoa. But it is a reality. I also had I want to turn a little bit to what's going on today in Chicago with crime and violence, but and our new superintendent. But in my grad school, excuse me, my grad school reading, there was a academic called community policing. This is his phrase, which I love, which was the police getting a warrant from the community to do what they were going to do anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I've always
Yeah.
thought you start participating with these communities, like, oh, you got to get those kids off the corner. You got to go get them off this corner too. You got to get them off this corner. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I understand why you're complaining about it, but they were going to do that anyways. Is
Yeah.
this really, do you really have control here?
Mm-hmm. And you know what? Find out. I mean, one of the things we would have probably did as a organizer was find out why they were on the corner, and really sort of investigate those issues rather than, okay, let's get the police to get them off the corner.
Exactly. And that's part of the um, obscene rejection by many in power to the defund the police movement. Now, I'm not an abolitionist myself, at least I'm certainly not for one immediately. I would love to have a much, 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 much smaller one, police force. But that said, it's like we have every politician, and Danny Davis has said this, but every mayor has said this. Lori Lightfoot said it during the campaign and while she's been mayor. David Brown, our new superintendent, has said this. He said it in his book. He said it in Dallas. We're not going to police our way out of our problems. We're not going to arrest our way out of the problems. Yet all they do is arrest and police their way out of the problems,
Yeah,
or
that's all
try
they
to.
do. Mm-hmm.
Right? Um, David, we're against special units. They all go bad. Lori Lightfoot's, we're gonna get rid of the gang teams and the gun teams, and I'm for those. I think those and the narcotics teams. I think special units are the ones that go bad the most. I think research proves that. But then David Brown comes, the protests come, and oh my God, we need a 100-man roving unit. It's like, God,
Mm-hmm.
I think we should just start recording these press conferences that they hold. And instead of ever having a press conference again, it's like pick a number from 1 to 50. And whatever number that is, we're going to play that press conference because you're going to say something similar we've all heard 1,000 times. We just keep
Oh
doing the
yeah.
same thing over and over.
Yes, I mean you're absolutely right about that. You know, it's like what the superintendent says, what the mayor says. You know what? It's just giving lip service. I mean, they're continuing to doing the exact same things that they've done before, and you know they've probably the more militarized the communities more than they ever have today. And you know, there's still this sense of dread as well as massive distrust of the police. And that's never going to change because they're not going to change.
No, we're trying to get someone from the program. There's this program called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. It's also being used in
Yes.
Olympia, Washington, I think. And it's got detractors, and it's no program's perfect. But because I think they still go through 911, and you still have to, the police, if they don't want to respond or think it's something the Cahoots responders should go to, they then delegate it. I think there should be just a straight number that doesn't go right to the police. Like call takers they could even be similar call takers, but to say, is there violence? No. Is it ongoing? No. Is there a threat, a serious threat? No. Okay, well, then you're getting these services. So for my viewers, Cahoots is a program where they'll send out a mental health expert, they send out a social worker, they'll send out a paramedic. They go in teams of 2 or 3, and they respond to events that are not imminent violence, or there is violence already going on, that we have realized through research that sending police who are ill-equipped to handle it with a gun and a uniform and the power of force and law that they bring only makes the situation worse. So it is possible. It's working there. It has had some good responses. It doesn't mean the program can't be improved. I'm sure it can be. We're trying to get someone from the program on in a few weeks to talk about it. But I think this is one of Lori Lightfoot's big failures to this point. And I know she should probably get a lot of praise for how they've handled the pandemic. I know they've done good, especially compared to a lot of other cities across the country. But I think Lori should have immediately embraced um, a, uh, a a workable version of defund the police right away and said we're going to set a limit of 3 years. And at that time, the police department and the police union are either going to change or they're going to be eliminated. And we're going to just create a whole new agency. And that public safety agency can have a mixture of social services embedded in it, domestic violence experts, sexual assault people, people that work on mental health, drug addiction, all of those issues. We can stand up this separate agency. And you either have the police and the police unions of turn order police and the police department change or they have to be eliminated. That to me was a failure because she should be hosting right now. There should be a citywide discussion going on about what defund could look like and what services that could be a call away to people could be. What caps, if you're going to bring these beat meetings back, what they could look like, right? Lori could have been a national leader on that, and I just think her dismissing it was a massive mistake. So I just want to see how you feel about it.
Oh, well, you're absolutely right. But I mean, to be honest with you, my sort of own sort of opinion is that the opportunities were there, and she missed those opportunities. But I think that she's just a softer version of what we had before. I mean, in terms of like Rahm Emanuel and Richard Daley. And, there is not going to be any sort of change within this city itself unless the people organize and mobilize for it. That there's no politician who's going to is the savior of the people. The people are their saviors of themselves. They need to mobilize and organize and make these folks accountable. All right. Sometimes people get immersed in, okay, we got this new face and they're going to do these wonderful things for us once they get in the office. And of course, we've seen time after time after time that doesn't happen. It's the people themselves who must organize, mobilize, and demand change themselves.
Right. And I think that's what a lot of people in these protests have been trying to do in Chicago. And I try to tell people, like, listen, I'm to one degree or another, I am somewhat of an architect of, I've helped build the police accountability system in Chicago. And the sad thing is it's one of the most robust uh, police accountability systems in the country, if you can believe that, between what is now COPA, Citizens Office of Police Accountability, the police board, and internal affairs. It doesn't mean it's working. And I got to tell you, I think while we have to have that, I think the answers are on the front end. I think our legislators got to start legislating accountability. If you don't want chokeholds, if you don't want someone's knee on their neck, if you don't want bad warrants served at 1 a.m. where they're doing shootouts, Breonna Taylor type thing, you don't want the George Floyds, we need to start making laws on the front end. And that's only going to happen if we force the politicians to do it. They just won't do it otherwise. They're still now, your thoughts on that? I'm not sure if you kept up with that. They're trying to put in this community council to oversee the police,
Yeah,
and they're still, Lightfoot's in over a year. We still don't have it. This came in 2 years
of
before
course.
Rahm left office, the idea.
You know what? Of course, that it hasn't been implemented. All right, because there's no political will to have it implemented. These agencies would have to, the police would have to change, and they don't. They are violently against sort of change itself. And as I said before, with all that's going on with COVID and the rebellions, that this stuff needs to grow because it's only the people themselves are going to be the ones to make some changes, and we have to organize and mobilize, develop these long-term strategies and tactics, and force our will upon the city and the police to really make some concrete changes, and that's not going to happen unless we're out there on the streets ourselves.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering, right? A couple last quick questions. David, let's say our new superintendent, David Brown, wants to bring back full force beat meetings. What is your and your organization in Austin's response to that? If they're going to bring back
Oh
full
well,
force
I
what
mean,
we've had over the last 20 years?
well, I think that there would probably be the same kind of reaction that people had then. That unless it's like something that's really about accountability from the police, from the city, from the elected officials, that it has a long-term vision of what the community can look like, that includes everybody within this process as well. And you know what? That's the folks on the street corner and the folks in their like homes, that everybody has to be included in this process. And I don't think that the police really want that, and they don't really want any sort of systematic change at all they want to do is lock people up.
Right. And if you look at the patrol officers, in the midst of everything going on, they elected a union boss, president, um, Ken Zara. I think it's John, but I'm missing his first name at the minute.
Mm-hmm.
This minute, he has got almost 50 complaints against him in his history, mostly
Mm-hmm.
internal, by the way, for not doing his job internally. A few suspensions, if not multiple suspensions. And that's who, amidst everything that's gone on since the Laquan McDonald murder in Chicago, that's who the police union hires. And by the way, he's got as many policing powers as we do. He's stripped of his policing powers because he's being investigated. And you have to have a reasonable suspicion to strip someone of their powers that you're going to terminate him.
Mm-hmm.
This is the
Yeah.
police union you're dealing with in Chicago.
Well, I mean, let me go a step further. I mean, he was elected like by the police to be the president of their like union, and obviously this guy, like has a lot of like problems, and probably is a racist individual like as well. But it says a lot about the police in terms of electing someone like him, all right? And it says who they really are. And based on them electing someone like this, how can you work within a system that would, elect someone who has all these sort of violations against him, who, says some of the most right wing and racist sort of like things said, and, has no accountability for saying those things at all? It says a lot about the police themselves.
It does. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing. And I thought also that was more reason for Lightfoot to embrace the defund the police movement, because he's not someone you're going to work with. He's not a partner towards accountability. He's not even a partner in like, I'll find funding to bring up these services. Wow, you mean so my officers won't have to go 50 times to the same house for domestic violence and domestic disturbances calls? You're going to send in people there to help stabilize what's going on there? Wait, you're going to have mental health and drug treatment for people? This is not someone you're going to get that from. He's completely. I think he was elected just to be at war with the city. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's
But you
it's
know
a
what?
telling
If
tale
you
that they elected him.
Right, but if you're at war with the city, and you're also at war with the people within the city itself, and the police who elected him want to be at war with the people and the city, and it says a lot about that there needs to be some real sort of subsequent change, like within the police, and that's not going to happen unless the people sort of like stand up and mobilize and organize and force change upon the system itself.
Elce Redmond, thank you so much. It was incredibly enlightening to hear your experiences from when CAPS originated. Hopefully, you don't repeat the same mistakes.
They will.
Everyone, oh yeah, they will. That's right. Everyone, it'll be up embedded on our Facebook page as soon as we stop broadcasting. It'll be up on our YouTube page hopefully tomorrow or shortly thereafter. There'll also be some clips up there, and also look out for the Chicago Justice podcast, which is coming with some new episodes soon, and this will be one of them. And also, if you're interested in our transparency work or in our litigation work, go to our Patreon campaign and become a monthly subscriber, and you can get behind the scenes access to our transparency work, to our litigation work, and new data visualizations and websites we're in the midst of creating. Elce, once again, thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy.